Hi, everyone. Mike Malatesta here, and welcome back to the How Did Happen podcast. On this podcast, I dig in deep with every guest to explore the roots of their success, to discover not just how it happened, but why it matters. My mission is to find and share stories that inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you. Today's episode is part 2 of my conversation with the amazing Cal Fussman, one of the most influential writers, interviewers, and podcasters in the world. That's not an overstatement. If you missed part 1, do yourself a favor and check it out to hear Cal talk about the value of a great question. And nobody knows a great question better than Cal Fussman knows. In this episode, you'll hear Cal's thoughts on how curiosity gets buried, the right way to shovel for gold, and so much more.
From 4 years old and 300 questions a day to you go to kindergarten the next year and you can no longer blurt out your questions.
You're
told, raise your hand. And then a process starts where it's the teacher's job to ask the question and the student's job to provide the answer. By middle school, there's a high level of embarrassment for asking the wrong question.
Right.
It's almost like a shovel of dirt every time you want to ask a question, but you hold yourself back, and a shovel of dirt covers up your childhood curiosity. The curiosity never goes away. It's just covered by shovels of dirt.
This episode is brought to you by The Dream Exit. The Dream Exit is a bespoke one-on-one advisory program designed to help entrepreneurs and business owners prepare for, and more importantly, achieve the dream exit they've earned and deserve, but often fail to get. A dream exit is the convergence of two giant goals. The first is positioning your business to sell for its maximum value. That's hard. The second, and arguably the most impactful, is preparing yourself, the entrepreneur or business owner, for maximum meaning and purpose in your post-exit or after-sale life. That's harder. But in less than 90 days, the Dream Exit process creates a customized and comprehensive playbook that will 10x to 100x your chances, and more importantly, achieve the dream exit they've earned and deserve, but often fail to get. So if you're an entrepreneur with annual revenue between 5 million and 100 million, and you understand why you need to prepare now before it's time to sell, or even think about selling to achieve your dream exit, email me at thedreamexit@gmail.com. And now here's Cal. You mentioned, you learned the power of a great question in second grade, right? You told that story. And you've talked about curiosity as well. And first off, I believe that all humans are born with abundant curiosity. Do you believe that as well?
When you are 4 years old, you're quite likely asking up to 300 questions a day and making your parents go crazy.
Right.
It's there.
Okay. I believe that too. I believe that over time, for a lot of people, their curiosity starts to wane for all kinds of reasons. Maybe it's being told no for the one time that trips you over where you're like, I'm not going to ask questions anymore because people say no to me all the time.
I can help you out there. I can really define it there from 4 years old and 300 questions a day to you go to kindergarten the next year and you can no longer blurt out your questions. You're told, raise your hand. And then a process starts where it's the teacher's job to ask the question and the student's job to provide the answer. And then what kicks in is exactly what you're talking about, where people by middle school, there's a high level of embarrassment for asking the wrong question.
Right.
And look, this was the case when I was in middle school. And you can imagine it now where somebody can just turn on a cell phone and catch you in the act of asking a stupid question and blasting it out to the world. And so you see this, it's almost like a shovel of dirt every time you want to ask a question, but you hold yourself back, and a shovel of dirt covers up your childhood curiosity. And then
that's good imagery. Yeah.
you get a job, your like first job, and you don't fully understand what's going on. And there's a group of people around you. Do you admit that you don't know what's going on? Or do you just hold it back and say, I'm not going to expose the fact that I don't know this.
Right.
I'll figure out a way to understand it later on. But for now, I'm just going to go on nodding my head and acting like I do. And another shovel of dirt.
Yeah.
And it just, the shovels of dirt just keep, the curiosity never goes away. It's just covered by shovels of dirt. And after a while, it can't pop up through the dirt. And it literally takes somebody to go in with a shovel and say, "What? Let's get this out of here."
Yeah, right. Excavate
the
you.
dirt off and throw it away and say, "Look what you got here." We should never lose your childhood curiosity. You're human.
What about as it relates to questions, Cal? Because we've been talking a lot about, how the internet can do a lot of things for you, and you can outsource all kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you think people, as a result of being raised in that environment and having things fed to you, you don't even have to ask for them; they're fed to you. If people are becoming less equipped to ask good, curious questions of one another?
That's a great question. The only thing I can tell you, there's a little story. After I spoke at UCLA Business School, a student came up to me and said, Cal, wait till you hear about this app I've just created. Wait. And I said, all right, tell me. And she said, you know how you go to conferences and there are tables outside the meeting rooms and people are sitting at the tables. They may have their computers out or they're looking in their phones. And said, I have figured out a way to connect them. Okay. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, if you have this app, they'll see who they're sitting with at the table. And then they can text them and say, hey, like, how you doing? And I said, well, why couldn't you just say, hey, how you doing? In real life?
Yeah.
She said, because they wouldn't. And therein lies a problem.
Right.
If you're not connecting, then curiosity just becomes harder. And I think people who are closer to the computer have a harder time. That's a generalization, but I'll give you an example.
By closer, you meaning more attached to, or they've grown up with it, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And
the reason that I made this conclusion, and it may be a generalization, but like I spoke at a cybersecurity conference, and people started to, I'm like in the front, not exactly on stage yet, but I'm behind stage looking out as people are filing in. And they started to come in the room and they went to the last row and filled it out. And then as soon as everybody was seated, computer screens came up. And then the next group of people came in and went to the second to last row. And then their computer screens.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was explained to me later on, like, you don't understand, Cal, like these people are protecting their company from being hacked, hurt. It's like watching over their kids. That this is how they have to think. And I completely get it. But my point is, when you're thinking that way, it's very hard to take a step back and just put down the screen, go to the front row and just be curious. And in fact, it was pointed out to me that you can, in the same day, you can be very curious and you can get a lot of stuff done. But it may well be impossible to, at the same time, get something done with a real focused approach and take a step back and be curious about something. You're either going to be in one frame of reference or the other.
Right. Sure. That makes total sense.
And the more we're all getting something done, the less time we're going to be devoting to taking a step back to be curious.
Right. How daunting is that as a speaker when you're watching people come in, fill the room that way, and then whoosh, up with their screens, and then you're supposed to come out there and,
That was the first. The first. And anybody who's got to speak to a bunch of cybersecurity experts, good thing to come armed with humor.
Yeah.
Right off the top.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to get their attention and get them laughing right away, because otherwise there's too much of a gravitational force probably to what they're used to.
Yeah. I found that in just about like all the interviews that I did, if you're sitting down with presidents, if you're sitting down with CEOs, you better in the first minute make a connection.
Right.
Because oftentimes their minds are in a lot of different places. And if you cannot grip them in some way and let them know that this is different, no different from your why handwritten notes matter advice, it's a differentiator.
Mm-hmm.
If in the first minute you make somebody curious, where is this all going? That's why I always recommend thinking about that first minute. It's no different from the first sentence of a book. Writing a mediocre sentence might give the impression that this is going to be a mediocre book.
Right.
But writing a sentence that makes you lean in is what I want to do in that first minute and make the person I'm interviewing lean in to wonder, where's this going to go? Or even just to stop and you see their eyes go to the right and they're looking at the ceiling because you're making them go inside themselves deep.
Right.
That's when you know, okay, we're going to have a great interview.
I was thinking as you were talking about that, especially with people who are used to being interviewed, they're often used to telling the same story over and over and or controlling the narrative of the interview. And so, like you said, with the first question, and then what you said earlier about somewhere in there, it has to converge from being an interview to being a conversation where neither one of us are thinking about, the product here, which is the output of this. We're thinking about each other in this unique moment together. That may never happen again. And I know there's experience that goes into making that transition. I'm always trying to figure out how I can get there, because those are the kind of conversations that I want to have with people. Is like, I forget that we're on a Zoom. I forget that we're recording this, and I forget all of this stuff because I'm just you've just piqued my interest, or I've piqued your interest. And it's like, when you get that, it's like nirvana, right? But there's not a script for that. Or maybe there is a script for you. How have you learned?
Well, it's interesting because this is what I am thinking about now in helping companies do exactly that.
Right.
I can tell you that the best questions make the person asked just as curious about the answer as you are.
Mm.
And so it is making sure that you throw out your canned questions and you come in with questions that are really going to make the person you're asking stop and look up to the right at the ceiling and wonder about something deep inside themselves, which, when you hear, as I mentioned before, that people are becoming archaeologists and digging into themselves to find out what's going to bring them meaning.
Right.
You may actually be helping them do what they want to do. You may be asking the question that they haven't asked themselves. They may be appreciative for that question. And if you ask that question, it's going to say, wow, they're trying to get to my core of meaning like I am.
Right. How did they know? How did they know? How did they know that that's what? Yeah. Yeah. Huh.
And so that's the way to go about it. And it's not like these are the same questions that you carry around in your pocket and can just put out like change. You have to go into the interview thinking about the job, thinking about the person, and thinking, what's the question I really want to ask here? Instead of, here are my 20 questions. And the worst part, the worst way to go, especially in these times, but it was probably always like this, is just asking 1, 2, 3, 4, next. Because you're only going to either get a very polished response because they were expecting the question.
Right.
Or if they weren't, well, maybe they were able to improvise well, and that tells you something about them. Maybe they didn't do very well, but maybe they were a great candidate. They just didn't have like a moment to really explore where that question could go.
Right.
And what I've found in interviews again and again and again and again, it's not the first question that gets the best answer. It may be the third or the fourth follow-up question. So if you're asking a question and then listening to the response and then moving on, you have done yourself a disservice because you didn't look deep enough to get into that person. I don't know if you want to use the word soul or authentic being. You basically may have asked a canned question and you might have gotten a canned answer and then you moved on, which means that you really didn't learn very much other than how they wanted to be perceived.
And you may have given the person doing that interview a bit too much credit there too, when you said that you ask the question and you listen, but you don't follow up. I feel like sometimes, at least I've been on some podcasts where they ask the question and they actually don't care about the answer. What they care about is getting to the next question. So they hear your answer. I don't know that they always listen to your answer.
Well, that's a whole nother topic to go into, because it seems to me that listening is something that's imperative to get the best answers.
Yeah.
Because people will notice how you're listening, and just the expression on your face coupled with the right question will bring out something different. And I remember I had breakfast every day for 12 years, most of the time. Sometimes we're traveling with Larry King, the broadcaster for CNN.
Sure.
And it drove him crazy when he would see somebody interviewing him and going through their list of questions and not being interesting. And one time, I remember him telling the story of being interviewed on TV by a woman who was asking question number one and then was like making sure her nails were polished, wasn't listening at all.
Oh my gosh.
And so he started to give completely different answers to the question, like total non sequiturs.
Right.
And then she would just go into the next one without.
She didn't even realize.
Had no idea. No idea.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, he was somebody who, and it's interesting because I just thought of the line in this conversation, which just gets to the point. When you connect with somebody, you have new thoughts. But he had a note from Frank Sinatra. And the note was explaining why he did not often like to do interviews, Sinatra. But he loved to be interviewed by Larry. And he said in this note that you make the cameras disappear from the room, which is the same way of saying you throw the interview out of the interview. We're just two people talking here.
Right.
It seems to me that if this quality can just be inserted into the job interview process, it would lift a lot of batting averages. And so this is where one of the places that I'm going to go next to help both the companies and the people applying for the job be their most authentic selves to find the right connection.
I think that's a beautiful approach too, to not just choose to work with one side or the other, but how do we make both sides come together to make this? Because I need someone who will do the job. As employer, I need somebody who gets a lot of meaning, like who really digs what I need them to do, right? As the employee. I mean, you really need that if you get that from each other, which is what you're saying, it's like a multiplier. If you don't get it from one another, it's whatever the opposite of a multiplier is, a divisor.
It's actually could be subtraction.
Yeah, subtraction. Right.
When the thing about hiring the wrong person, which I've been talking to a lot of CEOs and managers about this. Like, number one, and I saw it on your face when you're describing the feeling of how did I do this? If you ask somebody like, who's the worst hire you ever made, or what was the worst hire you ever made, you will see two things. This tortured expression on the face who did the hiring, because it all comes back.
Yeah, sure.
And two, it's mixed with this sense of bemusement and amazement of how did I not see that? How did that get by me? Over and over, I'm just being told, no matter how many times I talk to the person, I never know who they really are until they show up on the job. Right.
It's so true. Well, it's like, I think I mentioned this to you when we talked. It's like what you really want as an interviewer is and both sides maybe. So what you really want as an interviewer is you want to be inside that person's home when the door closes. And they don't have to be anybody except who they are authentically. And 99 times out of 100, I'm guessing that's what they will be. And as the interviewee, you want to be in the interviewers, you want to see what they're like when they close the door on their home, who they really are, because we can both play. We can both play who we want to play for a short period of time. Very doable.
You are 1,000,000% right. And it's another thing that I recommend to companies when they go into the hiring process. And number one is interview the job first, because the job may have changed over the last year or the last 2 years. And even just sending out the same notice to get candidates may be putting you in the wrong place because you're advertising something that no longer exists. It just seems to me, if you take what makes an interview great, I guarantee you when Oprah Winfrey is going into an important interview, she's looking into herself and thinking, what do I really want to know?
Right.
The same way that the company should look back at this job and say, what do we really want to know about how this job is going to connect with the candidate?
Right.
Like, how has it changed? What is it asking of people? And it's not that long a process. It can be done in a little time. And it's no different from the process I go to before an interview, where I'm sitting and just thinking of my questions. And when I go into the interview, I don't have the questions on a piece of paper. A lot of people do. And when you do go into an interview with the questions written on a piece of paper, you will often see the subject like leaning over, trying to read.
Yeah.
And the worst part of that is it's just reinforcing the fact that this is an interview. It's not an authentic conversation. You are being asked questions for a reason. The world may be seeing this, and that's going to make somebody put up a wall.
Right. Or you have producers or someone who are telling you these are the questions that you have to ask, as opposed to really exploring the questions that come as a result of having the conversation.
And again, that comes back to follow-up questions.
Yeah.
Because once the conversation's underway, and where the real great material, it's like digging for gold. If you ask your first question and you put your shovel in the ground and you lift it up and you see maybe it's a tiny sparkle of gold, you have a choice. You could say, there's not much gold here. Let me move over 3 feet to the right. And then you can put your shovel down, look in it, and maybe see another sparkle of gold. No big gold nugget here. And you can keep doing that all day long and go for a mile. Or you can say, well, there was this little sparkle here. Let me see what's underneath. And put your shovel in right under that, where you put your shovel the first time.
Right.
And you say, wow, there's a few more sparkles here. Let me shovel deeper. And then by the third or the fourth time the shovel goes down, there it is. There's the nugget.
You're the first person I've ever talked to who's used the shovel and dirt reference on two different things. We did it on curiosity and now on this. It's really cool. Actually, they're related, I suppose. But. Yeah,
it's I'm going to have to look into myself and wonder why.
Cal, I have 2 more questions, if that's okay with you. Do you have time for that?
Oh, yeah. No, okay. I'm really enjoying this. Thank you so much.
Sure. So the first question is, I know that at one point you had 6-pack abs, and I know that you've done Spartan races and some other things like that. And I'm wondering how physical activity and really focusing on yourself has or hasn't helped you with your questions.
I don't think my weight influences the questions. I think what my general shape indicates is, am I going after something with real sense of focus? Remember how we were talking about how you can step back and be curious?
Yes.
Or you can be fixated on accomplishing something. Usually, I find when I'm fixated on accomplishing something, it is accompanied by exercise, often pushing myself to my physical limits. But I separate that from my curiosity. I don't ever find myself less curious than I was the day before.
Okay. I guess I was wondering, is, going through those very challenging process or activities or challenging challenges. Yeah. Whether sort of like the singing in the shower type thing with, like, do you start to be like, oh, I don't know. Just like for me, I know when I'm doing those things, I'm really focused on trying to do what I'm trying to do really well. But something's going on in my mind that's where you can't help but think, right? Because your subconscious is always working. You can't help but think like, oh, I can apply that to this or that or something. And I was just curious because everybody has a different experience doing those kinds of things.
I would say that they get divided from when I'm actually pushing myself to the limit. I am like focused on getting to that place. And then I get into the shower, like either the hot water or the cold water will come over me, and questions to me arise out of hot water. Okay. When I'm really relaxed and the steam is all around me, I find it the best place to think about questions. And so many people have told me that like great ideas have come to them in the shower. So I know it's a place of great creativity. So I really would think about that question in terms of achieving something with curiosity, like being in two different places. Because if I'm in a boxing ring with Julio Cesar Chavez, which I was, there wasn't much time.
You can't be thinking, good point. Yeah.
I know it's like this guy just hit me to the body. It felt like one of those Hoover vacuum cleaner tubes was just stuck down my mouth and into my throat, and he hit the on switch.
Right.
There's no time to be curious. Like, what's it going to feel like? My whole stomach is coming out of me. So that's why I gave you that answer to that.
Okay.
Question.
Fair enough. And last question, I'm curious about this with your podcast, Big Questions. You've been doing that for 6 years or something like that. I don't know, a long time. And I noticed that you've changed the way you title things from, Cal Fussman, greatest question asker ever, to say Cal Fussman, the question coach. And you call everybody a coach now in your titles. And I'm wondering why.
Okay, that is a great question. What I realized, and it really comes back to the word authenticity, where we started, is I have lived a life where it's kind of a self-made life. I went from working in newspapers to working in magazines, which would send me to go fight with Julio Cesar Chavez or interview these people. And I learned how to keep the dirt off my childhood curiosity when I was, say, 23 years old, at a time where curiosity really starts to receive a lot of dirt over it. I started to travel around the world, and I did like 10 years without a home. And I had very little money. And so the way I traveled was I would get on trains or buses. I would buy a ticket to the next destination. Didn't matter what was going. And I'd start to walk down the aisle of that bus or that train and look for an empty seat next to somebody I thought I could trust, somebody I thought would trust me, and would sit down and we would engage. As soon as the train started rolling, we'd get into a conversation. And my hope was by the end of that ride, by the end of the conversation, they were going to invite me home, because otherwise I had no roof over my head. But, and quite often they did. And a party started, and they invited all their friends and relatives who asked me to come stay at their houses, and told me about their distant relatives that I could stay with. And they literally passed me around the world. And so my curiosity was constantly being reinforced day after day after day. Every person I met was new. Right. Every day I woke up, I didn't know where I was going, what I was going to encounter. And it was like being the closest you could be to a child, seeing a new world every day. And so that is what formed me. And it worked great when I stepped into a room with Mikhail Gorbachev and was told, you've only got 10 minutes, after I was originally told I had an hour and a half. And I could make him feel like he was on the train with me in the next seat, in a way that in that first minute, have him curious about where this was all going. And again, telling the publicist, leave the room. I want to talk to this guy. And so to answer the question, I did this without coaching. I have come to realize that, you know what? If you would have combined this natural gift for authenticity and spontaneity with great coaching, you would have been like at an elevated level. And like, look, I'm looking at a picture of me and Nelson Mandela, and I went to all the places that I wanted to go.
Right.
I met people that I wanted to meet. But what I realized is I could have lifted myself if I had found the right coaches. And now I'm trying to like find coaching wherever I can get it, because I'm realizing that it's not going to reframe who I am. It's just going to allow what I've mastered to get to a higher level. So that's the reason that happened.
Okay. That's a great answer. That's a
Thanks.
Very thoughtful answer. I wasn't sure where it was. I had no idea, obviously, where it was going to go, and I didn't expect that. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I can really even distill it further. As I mentioned, I got into a ring with Julio Cesar Chavez. I spent a week with Muhammad Ali. And I've been a big boxing fan ever since I was a kid. And as time passed and mixed martial arts became prominent, I started watching that.
Yeah.
I always felt like, because of all the fights, the boxing matches I'd seen, that I had a sense of what the mixed martial artists were doing. Just over the weekend, I was at a UFC fight, and I was sitting next to somebody who was a mixed martial arts expert. And as the fights are going, he's telling me what's going to happen in 2 seconds. He just knew it so well. And I realized, man, I've been watching these fights for years, these mixed martial arts fights, and I had no idea of the level of depth. And it just made me realize like the power of coaching. The same way I know I could sit down with somebody who's done job interviews for 20 years, and we could start talking, and I can make them see an interview in a much different and maybe a deeper way, just because of all the experiences I've had. So that's why I'm in this place of getting the coaching and actually becoming a coach.
Nice. Now, we talked about Tom Cruise earlier. Are you interviewing him today as well? Did I see something on your website about a live?
What I did is, after I saw Mission Impossible, I thought, and I know he's done this before, and I know other actors and directors are doing it, but before Dead Reckoning, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning came on the screen, Tom and the writer-director came on and just thanked everybody in the theater for coming to see the film the way they believe is the best possible way to see it. And I know during the pandemic, there was worry that people wouldn't come back to the theater.
Never come back, right?
And I just thought it made me recall the interview that I had done with him, where he was telling me about his childhood and the lack of control that he had. And here he was, after all these years, basically doing the things that were his passion when he was a kid, climbing the highest tree, jumping off the roof. now he's like hanging off of trains that are hanging off bridges that have been exploded, and he's doing his own stunts.
Right. Amazing.
And basically put himself in a position where he's a producer. So he gets to call the shots and gets to do his own stunts. He's getting to do everything that he loved. And he's also getting to be in control of it, which he never had as a child. And so it just resonated with me. And we had done a snippet from that interview and put it out in an animated form. So I just told the story of what I felt like watching the episode, and then just replayed the snippet to just let everybody know that you can actually think like, what did I really love to do when I was a kid? And can I, in some way, get that back? If not for a lifetime, could I make my weekend better just by doing something I loved when I was a kid, and having an appreciation and a control over it, and delight in it, just the way Tom was, I'm sure, so happy to film that movie, which is why he was filming himself saying thank you. And I just, it's a very short snippet from the interview, which the actual interview was more than once, and it went over hours and hours. So I wasn't going to do the whole thing.
Okay.
I just wanted people to get a taste of who he was and what he was able to accomplish, and somehow use that to make their weekend better.
No, I was thinking, when I first saw it, I thought, Cal's doing a live interview with Tom Cruise today, this afternoon. I'm like, how can a guy who's doing that have time for me in the morning to be on this podcast? I thought, wow, this guy really is good. If he's not, because I would be, prepping.
It all worked out great, Matt.
Okay.
I enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
You're really, I'm very grateful that you gave me a chance to talk out like some of my next steps. And so if there are people who are interested, who are doing hiring and interested in hearing more of what I have to say, like, please send them to calfussman.com. I'm happy to hear, and very curious to hear what their thoughts are, and happy to help out in any way I can.
Awesome. Cal, is there anything that I should have asked you, or you want to say that you haven't said because I haven't asked you before we go?
Actually, I when I look back on where we started, and your first question is a great way to start, because I would venture to guess, look, if you had asked that question to Tom Cruise, he might have hearkened back to himself jumping off the roof of his house and doing these flips into the snowbanks. He might have told you how his dad didn't show up and he was constantly forced to move, which meant he had to confront the schoolyard terror every time he had to move. And like, think of it, what's he doing in Mission Impossible? But he's beating up the schoolyard terror. I mean, he figured it out. So your first question enables you to take this in just the right direction. And, it basically took me into my future. So I'm very grateful for that. And as Larry King used to tell me, I can remember the first time I interviewed him and wanted to know, is there a way I could have improved? You know this better than anybody. And he said, Cal, you're great. Just be yourself. And I would pass that message on from Larry to you, because is a wonderful conversation. And just being your authentic self with the beer cans behind you, it brought out the best in me. So thank you.
My pleasure. And now I'll get some handwritten notes out today too to make sure I keep up on it as well. Cal, thank you so much. It's been a blast getting to know you. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, I hope it's not the last time.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. And before you go, I just have 3 requests for you. 1, if you like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing or following the podcast on whatever podcast platform you prefer. If you're really into it, leave me a review, write something nice about me, give me 5 stars or whatever you feel is most appropriate. Number 2, I've got a book. It's called Owner Shift: How Getting Selfish Got Me Unstuck. It's an Amazon bestseller. And I'd love for you to read it or listen to it on Audible or wherever else, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can get it everywhere. If you're looking for inspiration that will help you unlock your greatness and potential, order or download it today so that you can have your very own copy. And if you get it, please let me know what you think. Number 3, my newsletter. I do a newsletter every Thursday, and I talk about things that are interesting to me or I give more information about the podcast and the podcast guests that I've had and the experiences that I've had with them. You can sign up for the podcast today at my website, which is my name, MikeMalatesta.com. You do that right now, put in your email address, and you'll get the very next issue. The newsletter is short, thoughtful, and designed to inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you.